I was standing on a street corner in one of those hyper-dense districts where the air feels thick with the smell of diesel and fried street food. And just 10 feet away from me stood this wall. I mean, it wasn't a fence. It was a seamless 3-meter slab of polished concrete that just seemed to swallow the city's noise. When the heavy gate finally hummed open to let me in, the transition was just jarring. It wasn't just quieter. It felt like stepping into a different climate. The temperature dropped. The frantic energy of the crowd just vanished. And I found myself in this courtyard where a decorative fountain was splashing water with a kind of expensive, reckless abandon. I was meeting a contact who lived there, a man who spends his days in global finance. And as he gave me a tour of his micro-enclave, he didn't point out the security cameras or, the reinforced glass. Instead, he took me to a basement room filled with humming servers and this massive battery array. He told me, "We're totally off-grid." And his voice had this strange, quiet pride. "If the city's power fails tomorrow, my lights won't even flicker. We don't need the outside for anything." And what struck me wasn't the luxury. I've seen nice houses before. It was the redundancy. This man was paying a fortune to replicate systems, water, power, security, that already existed just outside his wall. He wasn't just buying comfort. He was signaling that he had the resources to survive a collapse that hadn't even happened yet. Looking at him, standing there in his perfectly curated garden while the muffled sirens of the megacity wailed in the distance, I realized I wasn't looking at a modern apartment complex. I was looking at a fortress built by a prehistoric brain, a high-tech tribe of one trying to solve a biological problem with architecture. And it really made me wonder, why are we spending billions to build these defensive archipelagos inside our own cities? And what happens to the rest of us when the people inside decide they no longer need the world outside that gate?
That whole story, the 3-meter concrete wall, the pride and complete redundancy, that is the perfect place to start for our deep dive today.
It just captures the whole feeling, doesn't it?
It really does, because today we are unpacking this phenomenon, this widespread and accelerating trend of building these self-contained, high-tech defensive communities.
Right.
But to really get it, we have to look beyond just the architecture. We need to dig into its origins in, deep human psychology, the constraints of our evolutionary path.
And the consequences.
And most critically, the profound consequences this deliberate retreat has for the very idea of shared public space in our modern megacities.
It feels like such a modern problem, though, driven by things we see every day, like rising inequality, the fragmentation of civic life. But you're suggesting the engine driving it is ancient.
That's absolutely the core thesis we can pull from the sources. This trend of pulling back behind high walls, whether they're physical or financial, it isn't just a modern societal pathology.
Or just the rich being selfish.
Exactly. It's not a simple moral failing. Instead, you should think of it as the predictable, even rational output of what we might call a Stone Age brain, operating in a totally unprecedented context.
The anonymous, overwhelmingly complex modern city.
The modern metropolis. The brain is trying to use these ancient, successful decision rules for security and status, but the sheer novelty of the urban environment means the output is often, maladaptive on a systemic level.
And that maladaptive output is the high-tech fortress.
That's the fortress popping up in every major city.
Okay, let's really unpack that psychological tension. If our brains are built for the savanna, for small tribes, the megacity must be putting it under just extreme stress.
It is.
We have to start with the concept that explains this. I'm talking about the evolutionary mismatch hypothesis.
Precisely. This hypothesis is absolutely essential to understanding any of this. Evolutionary psychology basically posits that our cognition, our emotions, our behaviors, they're all products of these complex psychological mechanisms.
Software, basically.
Ancient software, yes. And these mechanisms evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to solve recurrent challenges. Survival, reproduction, all in ancestral environments. So you have to picture small hunter-gatherer bands.
Intimate, stable social groups.
Highly stable groups where your reputation was everything. And the main threats were, physical or tribal. Very clear-cut.
But the modern city is the polar opposite of that stable band.
It is radically different, not just in scale, but in the sheer quantity, the intensity, and the fitness associations of social input you get every single day. And this massive divergence is what creates the evolutionary mismatch. When those psychological mechanisms that ancient software receive input so vastly different from what they were designed for, they often produce what we'd call maladaptive outputs.
Even if the brain is following its original instructions perfectly.
Even when the underlying decision rules are followed to the letter, yes.
We often use the sugar analogy for the physical body, right? Our bodies evolved to hoard scarce sugar, but now we're confronted with mountains of it,
Right.
and it leads to diabetes.
Right.
How does that same logic apply to our social brain in the city?
It translates into social and cognitive overload. I mean, our brains evolved to efficiently manage, about 150 stable social relationships? Dunbar's number.
Dunbar's number, yeah.
Now think about a city dweller. You're bombarded daily with thousands of anonymous faces, fleeting interactions, constant low-level threats from traffic, crime, financial instability. The brain tries to apply its software for managing trust and status within a tribe of 150 to a metropolis of 10 million.
It's impossible. The system just crashes.
The system crashes. So the defensive community trend is essentially the brain screaming, I cannot process this volume of low-trust information. I have to revert to a manageable tribal scale.
That's the psychological driver.
Yes. The defensive community is a large-scale stress response. It's an attempt to artificially reconstruct those primal pillars of security, those clear, discernible status hierarchies that just get totally drowned out by the chaotic anonymity of the city.
So the micro-defensive community, with its walls and its social exclusivity, is just architecture trying to fix a biological problem.
It becomes the architectural manifestation of using our evolved psychology of, say, territoriality and tribal affiliation to create a local, secure patch against the overwhelming vulnerabilities of the city.
This idea of an inherent stress response, it really echoes that classic and, I should say, controversial work on social density. Makes me think of John B. Calhoun's behavioral sink experiments.
Calhoun's work, which he started back in the 1940s, was foundational for understanding the effects of crowding, of social density, which is the physical measure of individuals per given area.
Right.
He was looking at how that affected psychological health and social structures, but in animals. His experiments created these so-called mouse utopias.
Utopias where the population could grow freely with unlimited resources, but in extremely dense conditions.
Exactly. And what he observed was, well, it was chilling.
I've read about it. It sounds nightmarish.
He found that chronic overcrowding and social overstimulation, even when there was no starvation or disease, it triggered profound social pathologies. And he termed the most extreme version the behavioral sink.
What kind of behaviors are we talking about?
Rampant aggression, complete social withdrawal, a total breakdown of social roles.
The details of that social collapse were particularly haunting, weren't they?
They were. I mean, for instance, you saw the complete dissolution of maternal behavior. Mothers would abandon their young or fail to protect them. And then there was this phenomenon of the beautiful ones.
Beautiful ones.
These were male mice who just completely withdrew from all social interaction. No reproduction, no defense. They just spent their time grooming, totally isolated from the chaos of the sink.
It was the ultimate pathological social withdrawal.
An inability to cope with the sheer number of forced interactions.
So if the defensive community is a solution, it's an architectural fix to avoid that sink. It's a way to deliberately downsize your social world to a scale the brain can actually handle.
Exactly that. It's an attempt to reduce the sheer, overwhelming number of forced social interactions, to scale down the social environment to what you could call a cognitively manageable scale, a place where individual reputation and control can actually be restored.
Now, making that jump from mouse utopias to grand claims about human society, that's where the controversy really ignited.
Absolutely, and rightly so. Early researchers, in the wake of Calhoun, they tried to map those animal pathologies directly onto human society, and they used some deeply flawed and contentious proxy measures.
Like what?
Well, they looked at things like venereal disease rates or divorce rates to measure sexual deviancy, and they used public welfare rates to measure a breakdown in maternal behavior in dense urban areas.
That sounds incredibly simplistic.
It was simplistic, it was often racially biased in its application, and it stirred up profound controversy. It became clear very quickly that you can't reduce human social complexity to animal models based purely on physical density.
And the crucial psychological pivot point came with the work of Jonathan Friedman in the mid-70s.
Yes. Friedman's experiments were key. He worked with groups of high school and university students, and he systematically measured the effects of high density on human behavior, aggression, discomfort, task performance.
And he found nothing.
He consistently found no appreciable negative effects that were directly attributable to density itself. And that shifted the whole consensus. It suggested that density was not, in and of itself, the primary variable for societal ruin.
So the key to our human resilience lies in that distinction between the physical measurement and the subjective experience.
That is the pivotal insight. We have to rigidly distinguish density from crowding. Density is just the objective physical measure, the number of people per square foot.
But crowding?
Crowding is the subjective response to density. It's determined by these complex social and psychological factors. Things like an individual's desired level of privacy and, most vitally, their perceived ability to control the situation and minimize unwanted interactions.
Which means that in a megacity, increased physical density might be unavoidable, but the stress of crowding can be managed.
It can be managed, or at least alleviated, through intelligent design that minimizes that unwanted social interaction. What researchers realized is that humans are capable of coping where other species might suffer. We manage density by improving the design of our space. Think about a prison. Providing prisoners with individual cells is a recognition that allowing them to control their physical and social boundary reduces stress.
So the defensive community just monetizes that insight.
It sells architectural control over your subjective experience. You're paying to ensure that the density outside the wall doesn't translate into subjective crowding stress inside the wall.
That transition from a psychological need for control to the architectural expression of it, that leads us straight into the economics of status.
It does, because once that decision to withdraw is made based on psychological stress, the architecture of the withdrawal becomes a primary tool for signaling your status.
Okay, let's move on to costly signaling and the architecture of status. But before we get into the signaling part, let's just clearly define what a modern micro-defensive community is in all its technological glory.
Right, because these are so much more than just apartments with high fences. They're self-contained residential enclaves. They're characterized by genuinely formidable physical barriers. That polished concrete wall you described, maybe 3 or 4 meters high.
But it's the infrastructure that's key.
The infrastructure is key. They feature robust, independent, duplicated systems. We're talking about genuine redundancy, independent power grids, massive battery arrays to just ignore municipal blackouts, advanced reverse osmosis water filtration system.
And their own police force, basically.
And often highly trained, privately contracted security forces that effectively act as a non-state police force.
Yes. And the space inside isn't just about survival, it's highly curated.
Oh, not at all. They feature meticulously curated social spaces, pristine courtyards, private gyms, exclusive social clubs, and their operational logic is based on something called niche partitioning.
Okay, what's that?
They're designed to optimize for hyperlocal stability. Think of it as a local Nash equilibrium, which means they are self-contained bubbles that cut themselves off from or simply disregard the health of the broader citywide systems that the rest of us depend on.
So in this anonymous, hyperdense city, if you're wealthy but nobody knows who you are, your reputation means nothing. You need a way to communicate your resource fitness to millions of strangers, and you need to do it instantly.
And that's where the costly signaling mechanism comes in. It's really just evolutionary biology applied to real estate.
So in any competitive environment, status has to be advertised.
It has to be advertised. And the resources spent on the sheer ostentation of these defensive features, the massive stone gate, the private guards in crisp uniforms, the redundant generators, that's the function they perform. These costs are exorbitant and they're difficult to fake, which makes them a costly signal.
By bearing that high visible expense.
The residents communicate their high economic fitness to the world, even to the millions of people who will never know their name.
The architecture itself becomes a public announcement of wealth and, I guess, untouchability. And this is perfectly captured in that anecdote about Elias and the obsidian.
Yes, that story is a powerful illustration. Elias, he's a high-frequency trader, and he lives in a district defined by these economic extremes. His residential complex, the Obsidian, isn't subtle at all. It's defined by that massive hand-carved gate sculpted from dark, expensive stone.
and the guards in immaculate tailored suits who just stand there motionless.
Right. When Elias drives through that gate, the action itself is the signal. That gate doesn't just block entry, it filters membership. And the exorbitant monthly fee, which pays for the redundant power and the private security, that is the costly signal.
He's silently communicating his economic fitness, his superiority even.
He is. And that signal gets reinforced by the sensory experience inside. You mentioned the humid, exhaust-heavy air of the city outside. Inside Elias's enclave, the sources mention a custom-blended cedar scent that's pumped into the lobby. That contrast is vital.
So he's buying insulation.
Insulation from the generalized discomfort, the unpredictability, and, the unsavory smells of the general populace.
Which means that security becomes a positional good. It's not just about protection, it's a status marker.
Exactly. A positional good is something that's valuable precisely because its supply is restricted, and its primary value comes from the fact that other people cannot afford it. Security, in this context, isn't just about crime statistics. It's about offering insulation from unsavory groups, or even just from crowds in general. The prestige you get from that insulation often outweighs the actual risk reduction. It confirms your high place in the urban hierarchy.
In a dense city that's constantly threatening to level social boundaries, this private, architecturally enforced security, it restores that essential hierarchical order for them.
It does, and we see this positional logic manifesting not just horizontally in these gated compounds, but vertically in the design of skyscrapers. It's the rise of vertical archipelagos.
Which is just a way of describing this defensive design philosophy applied to high-rise buildings, creating these literal layers of protected spaces.
The super rich build their self-sufficient enclaves high above the messy street life, physically and socially segregating themselves from the city's ground level.
We see evidence of this defensive architecture everywhere now, and not just in homes. New corporate headquarters are being designed more and more like ancient military fortifications.
Like readouts, with gatehouses and even decorative water features that basically function as small moats. It's an explicit architectural withdrawal from the public street.
And the residential sphere reflects this with a vengeance. The sources call it a residential arms race. In a place like Los Angeles, especially in the San Fernando Valley, developers are marketing the exclusivity of the wall.
I mean, contractors openly boast of building over 100 newly gated neighborhoods just to meet the market demand. And buyers are consistently shown to prioritize a gated community by a factor of 3 to 1 over other features.
Even older, established neighborhoods are getting in on this. Look at Park La Brea in LA. It's this massive 176-acre apartment complex. It used to be a relatively open space.
Right.
But as part of a gentrification strategy, they're enclosing the entire area in security fencing, deliberately cutting off what was a vital public space for pedestrians and local traffic. Yeah. And the spokeswoman for the development just said it's a trend in general to have enclosed communities.
The wall is becoming the signature feature of high-status, high-resource living. It's a physical assertion that your private resources are enough to replace the civic infrastructure and public services you've chosen to abandon, or at least to no longer rely on.
That shift in reliance is so critical. It leads us away from the architectural facade and towards the internal sociology of these places. How do they successfully replace the low-trust life of the megacity with a high-trust environment inside? This is the parochial logic of trust.
Well, the core evolutionary strategy that underpins the social coherence and stability inside the enclave is reciprocal altruism.
Okay, let's break that down.
So let's go back to the anonymous city. In a metropolis of 10 million, your interactions are fleeting, they're anonymous, they're often transactional. The cost of social betrayal, of cheating someone, is low for the cheater.
Because you'll probably never see that person again. Your reputation doesn't matter.
It's irrelevant. And that guarantees a pervasive, low-trust environment.
But the walled community completely flips that equation.
It creates an artificial, high-pressure environment where reputation is suddenly paramount. Because the community is small and the interactions are guaranteed to be repeated, cooperation becomes a mandatory strategy for mutual benefit.
If you cheat or fail to cooperate.
The reputational cost is immediately high within that small, defined group, and that ensures internal stability and high trust.
This is perfectly demonstrated by that anecdote about Mateo in São Paulo.
Yes, the sources recount this compelling story about life in a private enclave in São Paulo, and it paints such a vivid picture of reciprocal altruism in action. Mateo lives in a highly secure private community where residents pay a massive fee for their own security and shared amenities.
And outside, the city is defined by that pervasive low trust. Helping a stranger might be met with indifference or suspicion or even danger.
Right, yet inside the enclave, Mateo feels safe enough to leave his front door unlocked.
That's the key metric of trust right there.
It is. He knows that if his water pipe bursts late at night, his neighbor across the hall won't just help him fix it, but will also watch his apartment without any expectation of immediate reward.
He would do the same for them.
Of course. That is reciprocal altruism in perfect, successful practice. The mechanism of trust, which is dormant or just impossible to activate in the wider city, is resurrected within the walls.
But the defining feature here is that this deep, reliable trust is fiercely parochial. It applies only to the in-group defined by that wall.
Absolutely. The trust stops cold at the concrete perimeter. The physical wall is intentionally built to function as this powerful psychological barrier, cementing in-group, out-group bias.
By creating that clear, tangible line between us, who are trustworthy, and them, the vast, anonymous outgroup.
It activates these deep-seated cognitive modules for what we call coalitional psychology.
Which means resources, time, attention, social capital, money, are automatically hoarded for the in-group.
That's the default setting. The entire rest of the metropolis is treated as a secondary concern. It's a tribal survival mechanism optimized for isolation and resource protection. It creates a highly coherent and resilient micro-society, but only for the privileged few inside.
And if we look at this dispassionately, we have to admit it's a successful strategy for the individual.
It is the cold, adaptive reality. For those who have the resources to finance this architectural and social retreat, the strategy works. It drastically reduces the subjective perception of threat, it reestablishes a controllable social and physical environment, and it provides a level of comfort and security that's impossible to guarantee in the shared, deteriorating civic sphere.
And in the extreme high-stress ecology of the modern megacity, the sources suggest this strategy might even constitute an evolutionarily stable strategy, or an ESS. This is a crucial concept.
It is. An evolutionarily stable strategy is one that, once it's adopted by a majority of a population, in this case the resource-rich, it cannot be successfully outcompeted by any alternative strategy within that specific context.
So if the rich withdraw their investment and instead pay for private systems, those private systems improve and the public systems decline further.
Exactly. The strategy reinforces itself through a destructive feedback loop. I mean, why would an individual choose to invest heavily in a continually deteriorating public infrastructure, policing, utilities, parks, when they can just build a privately optimized, high-trust, redundant fortress that guarantees their security and status?
It becomes financially and psychologically irrational not to withdraw.
It does. The private success of the enclave is predicated on the public failure of the city outside its walls. It is rational, adaptive behavior for the individual, but with profoundly negative, corrosive systemic consequences for the city as a whole.
And those negative systemic consequences are what we have to turn to now. The erosion of the public realm. Because if the successful adaptive strategy is withdrawal, the inevitable result is the systematic destruction of accessible public space.
The withdrawal of high-income residents, and crucially their financial and civic investment from the public sphere, it's a harrowing index of the devaluation of our shared areas. When municipal policies actively support the massive privatization of space or they subsidize new, exclusive enclaves, it just accelerates the decay of the existing public infrastructure.
The city is left with fewer and fewer resources to maintain the commons.
And the consequences are severe. It creates what many urbanists have termed the South Africanization of spatial relations in the city. An increasingly brutal, architecturally enforced separation, where genuinely democratic space is becoming, well, all but extinct.
This separation is manifested through the active engineering of exclusion, particularly in spaces that are nominally public but are functionally private. And we see this most clearly in the phenomenon of intentional exclusion in public-private spaces.
Let's start with parks. Formerly, public parks are increasingly run by private organizations, which operate with a very different mission than a municipal parks department.
Right, like the Central Park Conservancy in New York or the Bryant Park Restoration Corporation.
Exactly. These private entities are often vastly better funded than the city's official parks department, and that gives them immense control over policy, design, and most importantly, who gets to use the space.
And their focus isn't on universality.
No, it's on creating orderly, controlled retreats designed specifically for an appropriate public office workers, tourists, upper-class residents.
The famous transformation of Bryant Park in Midtown Manhattan is a key case study here. It was once plagued by crime, used by drug dealers and loiterers.
And when the Bryant Park Restoration Corporation took over, they didn't just add flowers, they implemented these strategic urban design principles, often based on the work of William White, but with a very exclusionary twist. They lowered walls, they leveled the ground, they added desirable amenities like high-end food kiosks.
It was described as pacification by cappuccino.
A great phrase. The strategy wasn't to police the entire park equally, but to make the space so attractive and so densely populated by the desired clientele that there was simply no physical or social room left for the undesirables.
And this curation was enforced by their own private security guards.
It was. And the definition of undesirables was generally expansive. It covered the homeless, street people, anyone engaging in unsolicited political activity. The message conveyed through this private stewardship is unmistakable. Public space is increasingly seen as an object of visual consumption, usable only by a comfortable, paying public.
But the exclusionary logic gets even more cynical when we look at exclusionary plazas, the privately owned public spaces, or POPS.
Hi, yes, the POPS.
Developers build these to earn zoning bonuses. But the conventional wisdom is often that these barren, unusable plazas are just unintended side effects of cost-saving or architectural modernism.
The sources strongly refute that idea. Study after study shows that making these plazas unusable is often a very intentional design choice, driven by the developer's desire for exclusion. They get a public subsidy, the zoning bonus, but then they deliberately design the space to minimize its use by the general public.
Especially those who might linger or appear threatening to corporate tenants.
Exactly.
Let's zoom in on the specific techniques of this architectural exclusion. The example of the Alliance Capitol Building Plaza at 1345 6th Avenue is perfect. The sidewalks outside are packed, but the plaza itself is always empty.
It's a masterclass in architectural deterrence. The plaza covers 10,000 square feet, but the design actively prevents its use. It only offers 3 benches, so you can't have large groups gathering.
And worse than that,
2 of those 3 benches are strategically positioned to be sprayed by a fine mist from the nearby fountain, making them physically undesirable to sit on. And crucially, the large fountains themselves, which consume a vast amount of the physical space, are designed with no ledges. Sitting is impossible.
so half of that 10,000 square feet is literally off limits under water or mist.
It is. This is a cynical application of architecture to define, through negative space, who belongs and who is excluded. And planners involved have confirmed that building owners deliberately sought an environment that encouraged brief admiration of the structure, but actively discouraged lingering, complex social interaction or the presence of anyone who might be judged unsightly.
This systematic effort to sanitize public space just highlights the deep and ongoing struggle for public definition. This contest over who is morally and legally entitled to use the shared space of the city.
And this struggle is perfectly illustrated by the decades-long clashes over places like People's Park in Berkeley, California. That's where two fundamentally opposed visions of what public space even is just collide.
The first vision is the activist vision. It sees public space as the ideal of the Greek agora.
That vision demands a space for free, unmediated political interaction, a forum where challenges to power are permitted, where disorder is tolerated, and where the marginalized, like the homeless, can find refuge and community.
It sees the space as inherently political.
Taken and used by the citizens for collective self-expression and necessary friction, it juxtaposes politics, commerce, spectacle, just like the ancient Greek model.
And the opposing viewpoint is the planner or authority vision.
This vision is entirely controlling. It sees public space as a carefully controlled, orderly retreat intended primarily for recreation and visual spectacle, and it's usable only by an appropriate public.
The explicit goal is to make the desired users comfortable,
and to prevent them from being driven away by anything deemed unsightly, whether that's homeless people, aggressive panhandling, or unsolicited political activity. This vision emphasizes consumption and comfort over challenging civic friction.
The success of the micro-defensive community, this architectural withdrawal of the wealthy, it signifies the flight of resources, both financial and civic, from supporting that first vision. It undercuts the very possibility of the open, democratic city.
It does.
Which leads us to a final devastating consequence, the loss of the third place.
The urban sociologist Ray Oldenburg deeply lamented this loss. He defined third places. Spaces like bars, coffee houses, general stores, town squares, as these vital social arenas, distinct from the home, which is the first place, and work, the second place.
What made them so vital to him?
Oldenburg argued that they acted as a powerful leveler of status. In a true third place, everyone, regardless of their wealth, their title, their housing, they sit together and are exposed to the same spontaneous social pressures.
And their main activity is just talking.
Conversation, which is essential for freedom and contentment. It's where shared civic norms are created, debated, and maintained through low-stakes interaction.
But the defensive segregation that's encouraged by the success of these enclaves, it just runs completely counter to the spirit of the third place. The withdrawal leads to what MP Baumgartner described in her study of suburbia as moral minimalism.
Moral minimalism. It describes an extreme aversion to the personal exercise of social control or any direct confrontation with strangers. In her case study of a suburban area, residents preferred to delegate the monitoring and sanctioning of strangers to anonymous officials, police, administrators, private security.
Rather than confront issues themselves.
Right. They prefer flight rather than fight. And the ease of withdrawing into private enclaves, the ability to just drive through a gate and cut off all contact, it allows residents to prioritize that flight over the difficult, often uncomfortable work of managing a complex, shared civic life.
So the defensive segregation of the city undercuts the viability of the third place, which absolutely requires constant, often challenging, spontaneous interaction to thrive.
When the powerful withdraw into these self-sufficient fortresses, they are choosing to abandon the complexity and the necessary friction of a shared civic existence.
So this deep dive has really revealed a powerful and, frankly, disheartening feedback loop. The social stress and anonymity of the modern megacity trigger this deep, ancient psychological need for control and tribal security.
And the resulting solution, the micro-defensive community, is an evolutionarily successful strategy for the wealthy. It's effectively using ancient tribal logic to survive and thrive in this modern urban environment.
And its individual success is directly predicated on eroding the spaces of shared, spontaneous civic life. Whether it's the BOPS plazas engineered for emptiness, the parks curated strictly for comfort, or the demise of the truly democratic third place.
We started this with your story of a man showing off his off-grid server room, demonstrating that he no longer needed the city's shared infrastructure. When the wealthy use their resources not just for status, but for achieving absolute infrastructural and social redundancy, replicating power, water, and security systems entirely outside the shared municipal structures, it signals the definitive attenuation of the city's social contract. Historically, spaces like the medieval commons facilitated the collective pursuit of common goals that sustained the public realm. They required shared investment. The construction of these self-sufficient fortresses, therefore, represents a new form of enclosure law, where the powerful choose not to invest in or even need the system outside their walls, inevitably leading to the decay of the civic whole they have chosen to abandon.